I said, what's biodynamics? And then he started telling us about it. And it was like, suddenly, we knew that we'd had this interest and we could do it, but suddenly, it was like someone had opened up a box and it's like, oh, that's what it can be. So suddenly all these things about spirit and sort of connection with community and connection with the cosmos, and a personal interaction, personal relationship with the soil and place. It was just everything he said. It was like, oh, that is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
It was so amazing. It really was. It gives me goosebumps to think about it.
So, I'm going to introduce you today to an amazing guy. Met him completely by chance. Never heard of him, never heard of his vineyard, never heard of his winery. But I went to Damson Farm with the wonderful Alison Jenkins to look at soil through microscopes, which was the most fun. And I just happened to be sitting next to this chap. I introduced myself and I said, oh, hello, my name's Grace. And he said, oh, Grace Alexander. Still always thrills me when that happens, but it means I do have to behave myself in public just in case a member of Gather sees me. And we got chatting and I said, I'm absolutely, here for the biodynamics. I'm really dedicated. I'm really working hard to get my flower farm and all my growing areas really up to speed in terms of biodynamics, because I know it's the right thing for the soil and that you and I and Gather are learning about it every day. And he said, oh yeah, it's huge in wine, in vineyards and wine growing and wine making. Everyone knows that. And so he told me all about his incredible vineyard near Chew Magna called Limeburn Hill. And he just painted such a magical picture of such an incredible place. And we got to the end of the conversation and he said, do you want to come and visit? And I said, would I ever? I'm absolutely going to come and visit. And so almost no sooner said than done. I managed to take my camera and lots of questions, and he and I sat in his gorgeous kitchen. I was given both cake and then lunch. Sat in his kitchen and I asked him all the questions that I thought you might want to know the answers to too. I hope you love this as much as I do.
We planted the vineyard in 2015 and we'd been looking for land for a couple of years before that to plant a vineyard. Mm-hmm. What started it off actually was that when we got together, we decided we wanted to work together. So it was kind of a project for us to set up a business together. And we both wanted to work outside, we both wanted to do something productive and work organically and so on. And then only the idea of a vineyard developed after that, actually. Though we found the land here by mapping out, because we couldn't find anywhere to buy, mapping out all the suitable land within a certain distance of the house, south facing, right altitude, etc., etc. And mapped it out and then identified the farms. And this was the first farm that we contacted.
Wow.
So Georgina contacted Bryony, who owned the farm, and she took us round. And she showed us one field which she knew wasn't suitable. It was very funny. She knew wasn't suitable, and we went up to the top, and it's quite a steep climb, came all the way down again. I was feeling quite disappointed, and then she took us into the next field, and we walked to the top, and it's the field that we've just been up, and the view is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
And the slope is perfect, the soils are good. Yeah, and then she said, I can't sell it to you, but I'm happy to rent it to you. So we agree against my sort of ideals. We decided to rent it. And then after a few years, she decided to sell it to us. So that's how we found the land. And when the important thing, I think, from our point of view, is that Bryony had been caring for it for 25 years. Yeah. She'd been working organically. She'd been working in a really conscious way with the land. Yeah. When she bought it, it was completely. It's sort of been overgrazed, overcut for hay. The hedges had been massacred. Yeah. There were very few mature trees. It was pretty degraded. When you see photographs of it, it looks like a different place. Yeah. There's nothing there. It was really awful. And she planted most of the cider orchard. She planted a forest garden. She planted lots of new hedges. She turned the garden of the house into a productive garden. Really amazing work.
Yeah.
And it was a real honour, I suppose, for her to then say, actually, you can take on part of this.
Yeah.
And she still lives on the farm.
Yeah.
And so there is this lovely continuity between her attitude and her approach and her knowledge. She's got 25 years of knowledge of this land.
Yeah.
And so for us to be able to ask her about soils or the birds or whatever it might be is really fantastic.
Well, different conditions over the years, different seasons have their own qualities, don't they? And to have seen maybe a really harsh winter, or what happens when it snows, and all of those, that a real history of the land and
Absolutely.
a recovery of the land, it sounds like.
Definitely. She said when she started there was almost no birds here at all. And then when we took on the vineyard, there was quite a lot of bird life. And then we've been running the vineyard and most of the farm on biodynamic principles. And since then, the bird life has just gone up. Yeah. Every year we have new species arriving. It's really amazing.
I mean, even we'd only been out 5 minutes and there were these amazing kestrels and buzzards in the sky over the vineyard, which was amazing. And you can hear the difference, I think, when it's alive. You just have this sort of background awareness of how much bird life there is, just sort of as a soundtrack to a landscape.
Yeah, we've recorded 64 bird species on the vineyard, which is enormous. Yeah. There was a bit of research done about birds in vineyards, and they contacted vineyards all over the country. They collated all the information, and they found across all of the vineyards in the UK there were 65 species.
Wow.
I mean, we weren't part of the research, but across all of the vineyards, and we have 63 on our vineyard.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah. We've been interrupted already by Hugo shouting, and I do worry that because obviously my dogs spend quite a lot of time with me in my growing area. I do worry that they disrupt the development of a healthy bird life. We have pigeons, I think, is what we mostly have.
Does he catch birds? Does he scare them? Does he chase them?
I think just their presence probably makes the birds a bit wary. He doesn't chase them particularly, but yeah. And I think that story of recovery is really important, because that moment of building ground, sort of, and building a landscape from overgrazed, sort of overexploited, is such an important one. It's such an intimidating one for many people, I think, and it's amazing that you had it a bit further on in its journey, and then you've taken it to the next level of biodynamics. So what made you choose biodynamics as the way that you were going to grow those vines?
So we were always going to work organically.
Yep.
That was we wouldn't do it any other way. Neither of us knew about biodynamics when we first thought about it. Georgina took me for my 40th birthday to Paris for the weekend.
Oh, lovely.
Which was amazing. And we stayed in this tiny little flat. And it was a bed and breakfast. So the couple that owned it were there. And they were in their 80s, 90s. And it turned out that the husband was the Comte de Montbrison, the Count of Montbrison, who was the first biodynamic farmer in southwest France. Yeah. And we told him that we were planning on planting a vineyard, and he said, "Oh, you're going to do it biodynamically, of course."
Of course.
And I said, "What's biodynamics?" And then he started telling us about it. And it was like, suddenly, we knew that we'd had this interest and we could do it, but it was like someone had opened up a box, and it was like, oh, that's what it can be. So suddenly all these things about spirit and sort of connection with community and connection with the cosmos, and a personal interaction, personal relationship with the soil and place. It was just everything he said. It was like, oh, that is what we're looking for. Yeah. It was so amazing. It really was. It gives me goosebumps to think about it. And he was such an amazing guy. Fantastic moustache, hair sort of combed back, cravat. Yeah. Really sort of aristocratic.
Yeah. Not everyone who's into biodynamics is a hippie.
He was fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking a moment ago about how it makes such a difference to I think, come into a world without necessarily having trained in that world. And I wonder if that made a difference, that you had the intention that you were going to grow wine, but you didn't have any of that sort of the baggage of how it had always been done. So you were open to that box being opened, and came at it from a very different view.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think neither of us knew anything about the wine world. I had fallen in love with vineyards. I'd lived in Vienna for a couple of years, and Vienna, on two sides of Vienna there are vineyards, and Vienna has the most beautiful relationship between the city and people in the city who come out on the tram, and then you have this layer of agriculture, which is mainly vineyards on two sides, and then you have the forest. And so you have these people who look after the vineyards, relatively small. They take the grapes, they make the wine at a little building at the bottom of the vineyard. They have a little table. People come out from the city and they drink the wine. And there's this beautiful connection backwards and forwards between agriculture and culture, and it's absolutely of its place. It's not like anywhere else. And I just loved that. I think I've always yearned for that connection with land. I've always brought up in a city, but that showed that you can have the city and land and meaning. I think most of the wine, it's grown there and it's drunk there, so there's no air miles. It's really fantastic.
There's also something that I think is an idea in permaculture and biodynamics, is about this idea of the garden as a woodland edge. And when you said about there being a city and there being a forest, and the thing in the middle is the really interesting, exciting, growing areas, which I think is fascinating. And
I would totally agree with that. I think as soon as it gets too big, then you lose that. Whereas what we're trying to produce or try and create on the vineyard is edges everywhere. So we have small blocks of vines. We don't have long rows. And we space the vines out in such a way that we have lots of room and air and growth underneath the vines. So we grow our vines high, which means that you have a sort of a high up sprawling vine and lots of wildflowers, lots of perennials, lots of grasses underneath. So it's full of life. And we have to mow between the rows maybe once or twice a year, just so we can get access. But really, it's just every metre there's a new edge, and up there's a new edge. So in 3 dimensions, or 4 dimensions, there's all of these edges, and that gives us a massive amount of life. We have, I don't know how many butterfly species, maybe 20 different butterfly species we've identified, and you look through at this time of year and there's spiders' webs everywhere. So we don't, because we don't spray some of the things that other people spray, you don't get rid of any insects, and it just fills up with life.
And you have the mature trees as the windbreak down the middle as well, and how that creates another edge, a bigger edge, a more dramatic edge, but I think also a space for people there too. And that's where you have the seating area and some really beautiful pathways that go through that, which is sort of, I think, really speaks to the idea of human beings being part of the sort of the biosphere and the wildlife that's inhabiting that space as well. We're just another slightly bigger mammal.
Yes, totally. Yes, so biodiversity for me includes people. Yes, so if you're trying to encourage biodiversity, you're also trying to encourage that sort of much more natural interaction of people with the land as well. Not as human beings as separate. So creating spaces for that to happen, creating places to encourage that interaction is really important to us. It kind of leads to one of the key principles of biodynamics, which is this idea that a place has a spirit. And we work with this idea. It started out as a really nice idea in my mind, and then over time, the more we've worked here, the more it's become the sort of overriding principle, is that every place that you have, every place that you are in the land has its own spirit. And the role of a farmer or a grower is to connect with that spirit and allow that spirit to achieve its potential. I think that's such a key idea. So that potential is also, everyone has the potential to be lots of different things, and the land obviously has the potential to be lots of different things. So we could have cattle, we could have an orchard, we could have crops, but we've chosen to have a vineyard. So the potential of the land to have a vineyard is good, but what are the other potentials it has? So how can it achieve its maximum sort of lifefulness, maximum biodiversity, maximum health, maximum richness? And that's our role as farmers to achieve that.
I think there's something so interesting about sort of anthropomorphizing soil at its a very basic level, but a land and a landscape, because we were talking about horse's tail and mare's tail, and how it's one of a really good source of silica, so it's really helpful to have, but nobody actually wants it on their ground because of how invasive it is. But that idea that you could try and plant it, and if it didn't work there, it wouldn't grow. You know, and that being the potential, you know, that isn't the potential for that landscape. It's just not going to work there because they're almost self-regulating as organisms.
Yeah.
So yes, you've got to find its potential, and you can't impose that as your vision on it. It's got to be a bit of teamwork somehow.
Totally, and I think that in that sort of, at least a couple of really interesting points, one of which is we try and use only treatments for the land that grow on the land.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of work with, we grow a lot of willow, which we make willow tea. We use oak bark to make tea. We use dandelions, nettles, comfrey, valerian, yarrow, garlic. I could go on. I spent quite a lot of my time picking herbs and flowers and plants and turning them into teas and spraying them on the land or the vines. The amazing thing there is obviously we then don't have to bring things in.
Yeah.
So it's, from a sustainability point of view, from an energy use point of view, it's really good. But also what it leads to is this cycling of nutrients in the land. So you're creating like the physiological systems of a being, you're supporting them.
Yeah.
It's sort of a self-regulating system in that way. And that means it becomes absolutely of itself. And from a wine point of view, that is, you describe that as terroir.
Yeah.
And so if you're bringing in lots of things from other places, then you're diluting that sense of place in the wine. Whereas the less you do that, the closer it becomes to its sense of place.
Yeah. And we were talking earlier about how wine can taste very different to very different people, and also we met on a course about soil and microbes and looking at bacteria, for example, underneath a microscope, and almost that there's a sort of an exponential intensification of a quality where you're fermenting it or breeding it, or you know, whatever it is that's on that particular grape is magnified almost by the winemaking process and by the microbes, and in a way we're farming bacteria as much as we are, you know, the plants themselves and what they're growing. And that's where the quality of that wine will come from, I imagine.
I think definitely in part. There's this research which directly relates flavour compounds in bacteria in certain soils, which hold the flavours that you then get in the wine made from that soil, so there is a direct link between the microbial populations in the soil and the flavours in the wine. It's not the only flavours, but it does have an impact, and that is one of the key ideas in what people call bioterroir, as opposed to sort of geological terroir, which people often say limestone leads to these flavours. Actually, it's the soil that develop in that place based on the microbes that are in that place. They're what creates the terroir, or part of the terroir. Obviously, there are other things, aspect, climate, weather, all those, the variety of the vine, they all have an impact as well. To get even closer, I suppose the other aspect to bring it even more to its place, which relates to the fermentation aspect, is the use of the yeast from the land. So we also, the more richness you have in the land from a biodiversity point of view, the healthier the populations of wild yeast you have. Yeast, of course, is sort of related to fungus, and if you use fungicides, you start getting rid of all the yeast. And so if you don't use fungicides, you can allow a greater growth of that population. And then you end up with wines, if you ferment them with the yeast from the land, from the grapes, then you end up with a diversity of flavour in that wine. So a wine made from wild yeast, the way that it'll work is that a series of yeasts will start on the sugars in the grapes to begin with, and then the alcohol level will rise very slightly, and that'll be too high an alcohol level for those yeast, and other yeast will take over. And so you have this rolling process of, in the end, maybe 50 or 100 different yeast working on the same wine, taking it all the way through to 10, 12%, whatever it is. Each of those yeasts brings something to the wine. And if you compare that with a more conventional wine where all of the wild yeast have been killed, sterilised, and you add a single yeast. So you get one yeast. So you might have the difference between 100 yeast and one yeast. And that's, I look at that and I think about what we do, and then you taste our wine and you think, there's a reason that it doesn't taste like anybody else's wine. And that was a real, a real heartful moment when we realised that this is of its place. It sort of captures what the place is about.
It's like a much more complex version of my sourdough. Which is my sourdough starter will only really live in my kitchen.
It tells the story of where it is.
It's many years old now, so it's probably very much of its place. But and we were talking about diversity in people, in wild yeast, and I think diversity is absolutely sort of sums up so much of this process. And I was lucky enough to look at your compost heap and thinking about the diversity of inputs in terms of that, and just how we can really support healthy life in systems by allowing diversity at all the different levels, from the wild yeast by not using fungicides, but also the different materials we put in compost heaps that then make compost teas, which then spread that diversity across big areas, and diversity of people as well. And you were talking earlier about because I have recognised now quite early on in my process, I think, that the desire to be a closed system is not necessarily a healthy aspiration or ambition. So and you were talking about how some of your relationships with some of your local farmers were really important to how your business works. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think it sort of stems from the idea, one of the biodynamic ideas, that you work with the farm as an organism. And when Steiner talked about that originally, he was talking about quite large farms which had the possibility of having everything that they need on that land. And since then, farming has become much more specialised. And also, it's not about self-sufficiency anymore. It's not about providing food for you or your local community. So much of it is about long-distance trade. So this idea of in biodynamics that that organism which is self-sufficient is a positive sort of attitude, because it has some really strong principles of sustainability, like recycling nutrients within the system, not flying things in, not sending things out, trying to keep as many closed loop cycles as possible. But in our world, that is not only is it not possible, I'd also say it's not something that we should really be aiming for completely, because we're such an interconnected world that in my view, the idea of the organism is that you're creating beneficial relationships with lots and lots of other parts of the world. And you could say that a beneficial relationship would be the fact that that we could sell our wine to a local shop, and then the people in the area know about our wine, and they enjoy the wine. The shop succeeds, that becomes part of the community. They come back for the wine. We do events with them, and in the end, everybody benefits from that. There's nothing negative about that. And so another way that we do that, or we do it in lots of ways, but one of the ways is that we have a farmer at the top of the hill who's an organic dairy farmer, and he cuts our hay meadow. We've got a vineyard in a wildflower meadow, so he cuts that for hay every year. He takes the hay, he then feeds the hay to his cattle over winter, and then we get manure from the cattle the following spring, which we then rot down and we can use on the land. So there's this a closed loop cycle. It's just not necessarily within the boundaries of the farm. And since then, we do other work together. So he's helped us with some rotivating. He's helped us with some hedges, and he also provides the manure for the biodynamic preparations. And for our pruning pastes and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, and in the end, so we pay him, and we take his manure, and comes from the land, and again, everyone benefits. So that's what we try and do with everything that we can.
Yeah.
We're always conscious of what impact. How can our relationships have a beneficial impact for everybody?
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes back to that sort of the image of the plants and fungal hyphae and these sort of symbiotic relationships between lots of different levels of people and life, but those threads of connectedness being so absolutely crucial to the health of a system. We're not meant to be container plants. We're meant to be planted in the ground. Yeah.
We've got a fantastic example of that in vineyards. So we don't use a tractor. We use a quad bike, which has big fat tyres, and any bit of equipment that we use is pulled by it. So any equipment has you've got at least 6 or maybe 8 wheels. So what we don't have is any compaction between the rows. So often when you go to a vineyard, you look along the rows and there'll be these sort of lines, and all the grass is different or something. And I went to a vineyard where we did some tests, and we dug a trench across the rows, and you could see the vine roots coming down and coming out, and then they hit the lines of the tractor, and they stopped. And so there was maybe a metre or maybe 60 centimetres of root, and then a metre and a half with nothing, and then 60 centimetres of root. So what happens there is you don't get the connection of the mycorrhizal fungi. And so what you can have across a vineyard, if you don't have compaction and you have the fungi, you can have this interconnected network across the whole thing. And as soon as you drive a tractor along it regularly, you cut it. And you think the difference. It's like cutting off connections between villages or families or members of families.
Putting a bypass in. Between 2 halves of a village.
Exactly.
Yes. It makes me think of sort of Charles Dowding's policy of the paths are part of your growing area. We think of them as completely different. We think of them in a very different way because their function is different to us. But actually the idea that it should just be one continuous network and web of communication is really important. So if somebody was starting out at the beginning of their journey with biodynamics, what one piece of advice would you give them? I didn't prepare you for that question, sorry. You can have a bit of time to think about it. So.
Piece of advice. I suppose the first thing would be to ask yourself why. I think that's the big thing. Because I teach biodynamics and I teach about biodynamic wine growing and viticulture, a big part of it is the motivation. And I do, there is an aspect of, because biodynamics in wine has this, for many people, has a higher quality, it's connected with a higher quality of wine. because there's so much evidence that points to that, then some people will start to do it purely from a financial point of view, which obviously is the motivation that doesn't work. So but I think when you begin to understand your motivation, what it is, why it is that you're drawn to this, then that helps guide you when you're making decisions. So when you start with your own motivation, and then I suppose the next thing is to recognise that every single thing that you do is about your place. It isn't about the principles of biodynamics. It isn't about the theory. It isn't about why someone over there does it or someone over there does it differently. It's about understanding what is best for bringing out the potential of your place.